Just lately I've been playing a lot of the Micro Chapbook RPG, and what it is a very simple solo dungeon crawl. So your single character is going into a randomly generated dungeon, defeating monsters, finding treasure, increasing your stats, and hopefully defeating the boss. Now, character creation is very simple. You just have 4 statistics, which are strength, dexterity, wits and charisma. They are used for various checks, and in order to perform a check you need to roll your stat score or less on a d6. If you have a proficiency in one of the stats, for instance fighters have proficiency in strength, they roll 2 dice and pick the best one. So you divide up your 7 points between your stats. You can't have less than 1 in a stat, and you can't have more points than 4. You choose your class, fighter, ranger, wizard or bard, each very good at particularly different things, and you will get a proficiency in a different stat for each class you choose. Then you can choose a race, a human, halfling, dwarf or elf. They each get a +1 in one of their stats. You are encouraged throughout to create your own classes and races and things like that, to do your own thing. Your health and willpower are your final 2 stats, which are determined by adding your strength and dexterity +20 for health and your wits and charisma +20 for willpower. Now you can add 10 instead of 20 to those if you want a more challenging game. You roll 2d6 for gold, and you can spend them on weapons and equipment and armour. And the armour adds to your health and or willpower, depending on what it is. And as your health and willpower fluctuate a lot, I've been using these little pocket health trackers, which mean you don't make a mess of your character sheet by having to rub everything out all the time. So when you enter your dungeon, you create the entrance room by rolling 2d6, and that tells you how big it is in terms of how many squares. So that will be 8 squares, that first room. And then you roll a d3 to tell you how many doors are there. So in this case it will be 3 doors. And when you try to go through a door, you roll on the doorways chart, which may be a little bit different for each dungeon. So you roll the d6. In this case it's unlocked. If it's stuck you have to do a strength check. If it's locked you have to do a wits check. If it's trapped you have to do a wits check, and if you fail you take 1d3 health damage. When you leave the entrance and go to a new room, you roll the size again, in this case 9. So that will be 9 squares big. And then you roll to see how many doors there are, 1d3, 3 in this case. And then you roll to see what type of room it is. Now each dungeon again will have different entries here. So in this case it's a dirt room and it has no effect, whereas other rooms, for instance whetstone, will add +1 to your dexterity rolls. So when you roll to do a dexterity check, that will be a 7 in that case, and that is not going to be less than my dexterity of 2. So it just makes things more difficult in different ways, and the crumbling crypts in this case, in this dungeon, can end up doing you damage. And then finally, when you discover a new room, you find out what monster is in it. In this case, Crawling Hand. And this column here, the max column, tells you the maximum number of monsters that can be in it. So Crawling Hands can be up to 6, so you roll a d6 and there's just 1. So you can have a maximum of 4 legless corpses, only a maximum of 2 deformed servants, and only 1 suited beast or necrolord at any time. Now each dungeon is probably going to have a boss, and you can only defeat the boss once you've defeated all of these other monsters. So when you've come across all 5 of those, then there's a possibility you could face the boss. But if you roll a 6 before you've defeated all of those, then you have to re-roll. and the boss will only show up in certain rooms, so that also makes life a little bit difficult. If I only had one tiny criticism, and I'm not sure it is much of one, I had those two significant rooms next to each other, and I was waiting to face the boss because I defeated all of the other monsters, and I just kept going between the two rooms, hoping to roll a 6, because when you've cleared a room and you go back into it, you roll a die to see if any more monsters have shown up. If you roll a 6, they have, so you have to roll on the monster chart. I was going between these two rooms time after time, hoping to roll a 6 to try and get a new monster, and then hoping that I would roll another 6 for it to be the boss. And it just seemed a bit silly hopping between these two rooms time after time to try and find the boss. I don't know if it might lead a little house rule to avoid having to do that, or if it might make it a bit too easy perhaps. But anyway, that's just one little thing I found a bit weird. Combat is very simple, and it follows the same steps each round. The first step you take is to check bravery, so you have to roll your charisma or less on a d6, and I succeeded. My charisma is 2, but if I failed, then I would lose willpower, depending on the monster's willpower damage chart here, because that you're coming up against such terrifying monsters that it wears away at your willpower. And if you ever get to 0 willpower, then you have to add +1 to all your die rolls when you're doing a stat check. So after you've done the bravery check, which you do every round, you then go on to ranged combat. If the room is 4 squares or bigger, and in ranged combat you're doing a dexterity check if you've got a ranged weapon. I failed. If you miss, it doesn't matter, but if you hit, then you roll damage for your ranged weapon, and that damage is taken off the monster's life force. Then you move on to melee combat. You must make a melee attack, whether you make a ranged attack or not. You do a strength check. In my case, I'm a fighter, so I would roll 2 dice. Oops. Okay, that's fine, that's a 1. So I hit, because I succeeded my check. Then I roll my weapons damage dice, which in this case is 1d6 for my greatsword, and I take 2 points from the monster's life force. If I fail my check, then the monster does me health damage depending on what is in this column here. So a crawling hand would do 1 damage, a necro lord would do 1d6 damage. If things are going against you, you have the option to escape at the end of the round. So you would do a charisma check, and if you fail, then one of the monsters in the room will automatically do you damage, and then you launch into a new combat round, starting with bravery, going on to ranged if you've got a ranged weapon, and melee, and it keeps going on like that until the monsters are defeated, or you are defeated by going down to 0 health. When you clear the room of monsters, you roll a d6, see how much gold you get, and if you roll a 6, then you get an item instead. So you roll on the item chart to see what item you find. It'd be very simple to create your own dungeon matrix with a little bit of backstory. So you just need your doorways chart, your room types chart, and your monsters with a boss and maybe 1 or 2 specific rooms where the boss will show up once all the other monsters have been defeated. This adventure here is an adventure module, so-called, The Haunting of Gilroy Tavern, and it is a set map which you explore, and the numbers on the map refer to the references in the pages here, and so it's all pre-generated, this one, but it's still really enjoyable, a lot like a choose-your-own-adventure game. Other adventures are available, and some of them have been collected into this book, or you can get them from Drive-Thru RPG in PDF. And there are other settings available, including the sci-fi version, which I've not tried yet. And there are also supplemental PDFs dealing with things like magic and overland exploration and making mightier heroes and things like that. Basically, it's a light bit of dice rolling fun. You are going into a dungeon, exploring. The dungeon is created randomly. You defeat all the monsters, defeat the boss, and take all the treasure. And try and boost your character's stats to make them more powerful. Thank you very much for watching, and see you soon.